Okay, this is a short mini lesson on the rhetorical strategy of colloquialisms. And the bulk of this lesson was developed by Sarah G., Hannah G., and Lindsay D. They did an awesome job with it. And by the end of this lesson, this mini lesson, you should understand what a colloquialism is, hopefully, how to pronounce colloquialism, and also why an author or speaker would use it and how to spot it in a piece of writing. Let's get started. So let's start out with a definition of colloquialism. Um, Here's one way to say it: a colloquialism is a word, phrase, expression, or a style of speaking that attempts to be ordinary or familiar to the audience. A really key phrase in this definition is to the audience. And the reason that's important is because colloquialisms are tricky to spot and talk about because they're not universal. And what does that mean? That means a colloquialism to one audience may not be a colloquialism if that audience is a different audience. So you have to be very aware when you're talking about a colloquialism who the audience of that piece of writing is. What might be ordinary to a student, what might even be familiar to a student, may not be ordinary or familiar to an elderly person. It matters who the audience is when you talk about colloquialism. So don't try to analyze and talk about colloquialism unless you're sure you know who the audience is. That is a key to understanding colloquialism. Another way to say this is this: a simplified way of speaking where people are familiar with it in that situation, and that's key, in that situation. So some colloquialisms, it's a tough word to say sometimes, for students might include words like YOLO, right? Most older people may not know what YOLO means. Most students do, whether they like it or not. LOL would be another example that maybe only students know. And also OMG, right? These would be colloquialisms to an audience of students. Colloquialisms to a group of elderly people might include things like ARP. If you don't know what ARP is, then you're probably not elderly. ARP stands for the American Association of Retired Persons. So you probably wouldn't understand that because you're not an audience of elderly people. A Hooverville would be another one that you may not understand. And that would be something that only people that were born around the time or lived around the time that Herbert Hoover was president of the United States would understand. A Hooverville was like an encampment of homeless people, homeless families, and things like that during the Great Depression. So you may not understand the word Hooverville or Skid Row, but an older generation, that might be a colloquialism for them. Okay, so every group has different colloquialisms. Let's look at why a writer or speaker might use colloquialisms. The most obvious reason that a writer or speaker would use this is to connect with the audience and make the audience comfortable. If someone is using language that you're comfortable with, you're more likely to listen to what they have to say. So that is a huge part of it, right? It's trying to get the audience to feel a connection with them and their ideas. That's why a writer or speaker uses colloquialism. So, some examples of colloquialism, some more examples. OMG, did you hear about smoking? Smoking totally beasts on your lungs and owns them. It can even take you out. To a younger audience, colloquialisms might include OMG, beasts, right? Owns them, right? These are phrases that people might not understand unless they're a particular audience, right? Fetch, deaf by that, right? These are also terms, right? Yo, fresh, right? Went hard. Okay, these are all things that it sounds funny when adults even say them, right? Because they're intended for a specific audience. Okay, those are colloquialisms. So let's move on. How do you spot colloquialisms in a piece of writing? Well, that can be kind of tough because you actually have to know already who the audience is. In this piece was written in 2002, so that gives you a little bit about the idea of who the audience is. And both of the passages here, the one on the left and on the right, are written by the same person, Edward O. Wilson, and appeared in his books. So his audience would be people in the year 2002 and later who would have been interested in a book titled The Future of Life that discussed science and politics. Someone into these debates, someone familiar with these debates, someone who cared and is up on what is current in those worlds. So go ahead and read the first few lines of each of these passages and see if you can decide where you see things that might be considered colloquialisms. Go ahead and pause this and check it out. Okay, hopefully on the left-hand column you notice this. Greens, enviros, environmental extremists, environmental wackos, right? Obviously he expects his audience to be familiar with these, and most of his audience would be. That would be colloquialism. The rest of us may not know what that means. On the other side, you also have the same thing, right? Anti-environmentalist, brown lashers, wise users, okay, sagebrush rebels. You'll notice here you'll notice here that the author actually points out that some of these terms are for a more specific audience, right? More locally out west, right? Their own term, not intended to be more locally. So it's saying something specific about a specific group. That's another clue that it's a colloquialism. Colloquialisms are a great strategy to look for when you're analyzing the rhetoric of a piece, but you have to be careful and consider carefully if it's really a colloquialism or not. What was the intended audience, and is that a phrase that only that intended audience would probably understand fully? Hopefully, this lesson was helpful to you in understanding a little bit more about colloquialisms, how they work, and how to spot them.